Why should Christians create culture and not just critique it? And why is there so much profanity in children's movies and also creeping into faith-based films? And what obscure metal band will Daniel force upon us in this week's episode of Faith and Pop Culture?
Welcome, everyone, to episode number 4 of the Faith and Pop Culture Podcast. It is me, your host, Daniel, and I am joined at the desk, as I always am, by the chiropractor to my neck pop, Mr. Samuel David Camp. What is up?
Ouch. But in a good way.
Yeah, it's the kind of pain that...
It's the kind of pain that brings relief.
Yeah, which I actually just had my first ever chiropractor experience.
Oh, wow.
A couple of days ago.
How was that?
It was an experience.
Are you fully aligned and everything's been healed?
Well, see, I feel worse, but I did get X-rays of my spine, and was told that I have a perfect, beautiful spine.
Whoa.
Which I've lived my whole life without the knowledge, and now I feel better about myself.
Yeah, well, that's something you can just sort of hold over all those imperfect spine people.
Yeah, I might have flaws and faults, but hey, I can look down at people like,
under the skin. You're perfect.
My spine is more beautiful than yours, but
it's a weird brag. But hey,
when you got to scrape the bottom of the barrel,
when it's all you got.
That's all. But we're excited to just dig into some more just cultural questions, cultural stories. What does it mean as Christians to be a presence in the culture that God has placed us, and looking through the lens of Scripture on how we analyze things, or as we're going to get into today, how we contribute to culture and do more than just sort of standing, shaking our finger at all the bad stuff in culture. So thanks for joining us again. If this is your first time, or if you've been sort of on with us from the start of this new podcast journey. But kind of the first thing I wanted us to get into, like I just alluded to, is something that I wanted, before we got too far into this podcast, and too many controversies, or being angry at stuff, or just looking at more dicey, what's wrong with Hollywood and the agendas and all that, is to make sure we also just acknowledge that engaging sort of that relationship between faith and pop culture and just culture in general is more than just in the role of a critic.
Yeah, and I think we should say too, we are big fans of culture, and a lot of what we do is critiquing culture, but it's also, I hope, celebrating the good things that we see and sort of affirming that in culture, which I think makes us better as people.
Yeah, because it's kind of the slogan, or the proverb, or whatever it is, where it's always easier to destroy than to create.
Right.
It's easy to knock down someone else's sandcastle on the beach than it is to it's harder to actually build a sandcastle.
Yeah.
So I think that there is a tendency with I think with all people, but I think Christians are definitely a part of that group, of sort of thinking of cultural engagement as a negative, just looking at what is Hollywood doing this week to make us mad, or what agendas, or this movie, what bad stuff are they slipping in there? And we don't always take the more difficult path of either just affirming the good stuff when it's there and kind of giving credit where credit is due, but even beyond that, of how do we actually create and cultivate culture?
Yeah. How do we contribute to culture and not just criticize and tear down the things that we disagree with? And that, unfortunately, the whole criticizing and tearing down and sort of rage baiting sells very well, and you can make a good living at it these days. But it's something that we do hope to avoid with this podcast.
Yeah, the whole idea.
We'll start a separate podcast where we just
the more clickbaity, where we.
You'll not believe.
You won't believe number 4 on the list. But kind of this idea of creating culture, I think it's important. One, like you said, is because we personally just like culture, and we like movies, and we both play music, and we're just you do even beyond pop culture. You garden and till the earth and
cultivate the land. Yes.
But even beyond that, I do think it is something that is very central just to the Christian life and our calling as Christians, and and creation, and it can be traced all the way, the first pages of Scripture, like
Right.
very much, the Garden of Eden. There's so much going on, kind of in that story, that I think is kind of the provides the template for. Although, like obviously, in the garden, even like movies and the focus is not
Yeah, yeah.
cinema, but it is on kind of cultivating creation, contributing to the world around them in which they live. Because a couple passages of just sort of humanity's first kind of oldest calling. Genesis 1:28 says, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Or Genesis 2:15, "The Lord took man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it." And then even like Genesis 2:20, where Adam is like allowed to like name the animals, can be seen like interpreted as like the first like example we have of like culture making. Like
Yeah.
there's God created the animals, but and God named the sky, and like he did the naming in the first part of Genesis, and now it's like, okay, now Adam, you take care of the earth, you give names to things, like you begin to build a culture.
Yeah, and even in those like early days of the earth and of Genesis, it 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 seems to indicate too that it wasn't like the earth it wasn't like this immaculate garden necessarily even to begin with. It was like all the raw materials were there. Like there were trees, there were, vegetables and animals and everything, but the idea seems to be more of God inviting us into as a partnership with him to cultivate something beautiful out of all of this raw material, which I think is really just a fascinating way to look at it and to apply that to your life now. Obviously, we're not in Eden, but I think many of those mandates still stand.
Yeah, and I think like this person, like the whole like Eden narrative is like I love it. I eat that stuff
Yeah,
up. Like I just there's so much in those passages that I think has significance to Christians, like creativity and culture making, and just like it's the origin of our story as humans. But I feel like we can misinterpret, and I don't mean this as like a hot take, but like, I feel like we misinterpret that story a little bit, like that, and I feel like because we do that, sort of how we apply these mandates later is colored by that. And kind of what I mean by that is, like, I feel like there's a sense, like I don't believe that humans were ever intended to live forever in Eden. Like I think we sort of act as though that was like then the tragedy of Eden is that they are kicked out of the garden. Had they not taken the apple, like we'd still be in Eden.
yeah.
It would be a little crowded, but we'd still be
We'd still be naked and
we'd
unashamed.
still be naked and unashamed. Curses on Adam for ruining that paradise for us. But like if you look at like the mandate that God gave Adam to like be fruitful, fill the earth, have dominion, like that's inconsistent with the idea that we're gonna like humanity is just gonna be this small little tribe in this tiny little garden,
Yeah,
and like we're gonna live out. Like I think the tragedy of Eden isn't that we left. Like I think we were always supposed to leave. It's that we can't go back. Like the way is barred. The trees, kind of that intimate fellowship with God
hmm,
is broken, and kind of what Eden represented. But I do think like the mandate to go from the garden is just part of our, like it was always part of our purpose. Like Eden's almost like a training ground to like,
yeah.
hey, learn to cultivate things, create things, take care of the earth, and then go forth and kind of make the rest of the world like an Eden.
Yeah, and I've read a book and I've recommended it to you before, and I- it speaks a lot to this, and that's a book by John Mark Comer called Garden City, and he talks a lot about this and just how um, really what they're doing and that training ground in Eden is just learning how to take raw materials and to make something that is beneficial to the community and for the glory of God. And so it's very easy to see that in an agricultural sense. It's like you look at a forest or just a empty field, you cultivate it, you do specific things to make it productive but also more beautiful. Um, and I think it's harder for us now to look at our jobs or our churches or whatever, and try and make that correlation and see how that act of cultivation, that act of making culture apply in like our modern iPhone filled life of today.
Yeah, and I think there's sort of there's a sense that sort of yeah, like, how do you bridge that gap? Then the Genesis narrative, like what does that mean for like how we engage with culture today? Like I think because we see sort of Eden from the sense that like this was this sort of this perfect paradise, this sanctuary away from the world, and we need to kind of if only we could have stayed there and not have to go into this
Yeah.
dark and painful. Painful world that I feel like a lot of the approaches that Christians have today towards culture is like trying to return to Eden. Like
Yeah.
how do we sort of create another sort of sanctuary for ourselves, like that just sort of barricades ourselves from any of the bad stuff, and we can kind of live in isolation and not have to be out in the world tilling the ground like outside of the garden. Because even like one of the you hear all the time people talk about kind of like this nostalgia for just like the rural, like the garden, like sort of
Yeah.
like a lot of Christian even pastors are like poo-poo cities and be like,
Yeah.
before the fall we were in a garden, but like after sin, then you get cities. And like the
Yeah.
idea that like kind of these cities and like progress and stuff is just like a direct result of like the fall and like not how it should be, which gets challenged just by like if in like Revelation and stuff, like when it talks about the new creation, like when God does restore us finally, like it's not a garden, like it's a new Jerusalem, like it's sort of
Yeah.
heaven is described as like a city, like it's not you get you back to your little sanctuary garden,
Yeah.
but it's like a fusion of like Eden, like it's a
Right.
city, and then it's also sort of all the good stuff of Eden, like all the good stuff of like a city and like culture and stuff, and like those are fused together, which I feel like gives us a better template for what we should be striving for on Earth, rather than just trying to like back in the old, like just pull
Yeah.
out of culture and just sort of live alone in a secluded sanctuary.
Yeah, and I think there is that pull, and I think especially for anybody who does work like in gardens, and like my wife and I, we garden, and we're very, I mean, that's just like my happy place, of course, and it's nice to have those things like that. If you build a beautiful garden or just some sort of habitat around your house that's just peaceful, and like those are nice things to have, but that's not like the end goal. And I think it's easy to sort of look back at Eden and be like, oh yeah, I think even just the idea that like Eden was just sort of this um, workless paradise as well is just false, because even before the fall, he commands them to work, and like they're gonna be like building in a sense. So I think like in the garden, it's less to do with just perfectly leisure. There's everything is nice. There's all this great stuff, and you just kind of lay around and just enjoy your friends and family all the time, and more to do with working in partnership with God, creating something beautiful in the
Yeah, and
world.
to like create something within his, like like Tolkien talks about like sub creation. Like we can't
Yeah,
create like God created, but we can do sub creation. Like we can kind of do a lesser but like still important of like we
yeah,
can come up with world, we can come up with things of beauty, we can come up with goodness and like things that sort of add to and like point towards God, kind of God's greater creation. So I think as far as like Christians today, just like I feel like Christians should be known as people that are adding to and cultivating and creating, culture, not just people that sort of stand, as like, at the gate trying to keep in, keep away the bad stuff and,
yeah,
shaking their fist at, how bad Hollywood is or how bad art is or just culture in general. Like, do people see people within the church as those that are like actively contributing to, and like, and obviously not everyone can like contribute in the same ways. Like,
yeah.
not everyone, so go get a guitar and, go flood the world with Christian music. Like, but
It's
you
like
can,
there's a lot of people that shouldn't do that.
yeah, God, we don't necessarily want all people doing that, myself included, but you can encourage that and like foster that and encourage those that are doing that and contribute in your own way. Um,
which I think, I mean, that's sort of the sort of the God given blessing to everyone, is that He has created you for a purpose, not just to know Him, um, and to be in relation with Him, but to do something on this earth while we're here. And I think oftentimes we forget that, and it's like, well, and we sort of start to separate out, like, well, I have all of my, like, Christian things I do, and I have, like, I just go to work and have a paycheck that I give some to the church, and so we start to separate and have this, like, you know secular sacred divide, um, when I think, like, back in Eden there was not that divide. It was like your work is worship to God, and you're a whole person. And when you find that thing that God has put you on this earth to do, yes, to know Him, to be redeemed, but also, like, what is it? You're only here to for a little while, and what is it that He has called you to do, um, in your work? I think that is a much better picture of what God's called
Yeah, and,
us.
and kind of taking that intimacy, that Eden kind of mindset, and taking that into the world rather
Yeah.
than just sort of resting there and treating it as two different places. And I know one of the things we're excited for with this podcast too, hopefully not too long from now, is to get on some people, or like some guests that are creating culture too,
Yeah.
so that we're not just sort of pointing our finger and examining culture,
Yeah.
but actually like talking to people. How do you create? How do you contribute to the culture? But
And
I think
go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think one of the things that maybe might lead us to want to barricade ourselves in Eden away from culture is profanity in films, or just junk content wise. I know that probably is one of the main, uh, that is an influencing factor for why I think Christians can have a negative opinion of culture.
Yeah.
Is, hey, there is a lot of bad stuff. Like, part
Yeah.
of why we got to create good stuff is because there's a lot of bad stuff. And I think kind of as we go throughout this podcast, I'm sure we're going to dive into like a lot of the specific areas, like sexuality or violence, and what do Christians do about that. But kind of one of the ones that's been on my mind lately is just profanity. This has sort of been kind of for several reasons. Like, I just reviewed a couple weeks ago the movie Arthur the King, the cute, adorable dog movie. And again, if you were watching the earlier episodes of the podcast, like, a lot of unexpected language in that film,
Yeah.
kind of profanity, and sort of shocking, of like, why is there so much, like, why is there an F word in my dog movie, or why are characters just sort of swearing? Like, have we just become numb to profanity? And even like as a parent, taking my kids to a lot of like kid movies and then also just reviewing them, like, there has been a notable rise in profanity in films, like
Yeah.
like in kid movies, like the new Ninja Turtle movie or Puss in Boots, or like movies that you would traditionally, they might have some innuendos or something, but like, you wouldn't at least get profanity, like, in
Yeah.
which seems to not be the case. I thought we could kind of dialogue a bit about that, like, what's going on with that, like, as Christians, what do we do with that? And even like, because this tendency has even trickled into like faith-based films, like, sort of
Yeah.
there's just, anywhere you look, it seems like there's more kind of profanity. And apparently, and we can dialogue a bit about this, what we think about this, but apparently it's not just that I'm, a prude and I just, in the theater have my own thing. There's a lot of people that are noticing this. Like, it's not, there's been some studies. For example, I came across an article on the Wall Street Journal, which was about the increase of profanity. And there they quote a study by enjoymoviesyourway.com.
More on that later.
More on that later, in which they kind of surveyed apparently over 60,000 popular movies, which have released since 1985, and kind of tracked the usage of what they call bleepable words over time. And like, in that like data sample, they came up with the usage of the F word went from 511 in 1985 to 22,177 through early November 2023. And like, the S word was used 448 times, now over 10,000, almost 11,000 times. Like, at least going by those numbers, like, from their sample size,
Yeah,
like it just seems like there's a lot more profane words out there in the culture.
definitely. And I think the big caveat is going by their numbers. Um, like there's no doubt that there's been an increase in profanity in movies. Just one maybe note about that would be this enjoymoviesyourway.com is a service that allows you to like bleep out words you don't like and scenes you it's like an app that you can filter movies through that let you take out all the bad stuff in movies. And so take that with a grain of salt. And also just the and they say that there is just way more movies and TV shows now. And so I would just you can do a lot with statistics and data. And so it's like, yes, there are more curse words now. There are a lot more movies and TV shows out now. Like if you think back to 1985, like there's maybe a handful of shows,
Yeah, like with
like
streaming
at
now, like
all. Like,
you've exponentially increased
yeah,
the movies you can pull from, and like so like the hard numbers, and like you said, any service that is like trying to address a problem
they have a
isn't always they have a vested interest in that problem being as bad as humanly
yeah.
possible.
But with that caveat out of the way, like I think part of this is maybe just like movies and films going the way that they've always gone, which is like they're always going to be pushing the envelope as much as they like can get away with. In a lot, not all, but in a lot of cases, like I think the general trend is to push the envelope, and so I think with curse words in films for younger and younger people, it's no surprise that that we're seeing that uh,
Yeah,
increase
and once
in
one film does it, then oh, other filmmakers like, well, we can add those words in. Like we can, like PG-13 movies in general can have like one F word, and like didn't always use those back in the day. Like now it's you can count on it. Like there's gonna be
yeah.
like how much can we get in there, and like why they do that.
Yeah, I that would be my question to you is like, so like, what's it seems like maybe an obsession or like, why do these movies care so much about getting profanity into them? Like,
Yeah,
is
like I,
that is that is that just me kind of looking at it from the outside, thinking like what's the point? Like, why would you insert that? Or is it just that's the world they swim in, and it doesn't even occur to them that oh, we're not inserting these words. It's like that's just
yeah, they're
part of
just
the
not being
vernacular.
filtered out anymore like they used
Right,
to.
right.
I think it's probably both. Like I think we've got a lot more numb. I mean, that's just the nature of like being desensitized to things through media. Is that
Yeah.
like you can look at that with anything else, like sexual stuff, like the stuff you can get on like mainstream TV now. Would have been like just scandalous
Yeah.
20
Yeah.
years ago. Like the but you just sort of you move it an inch, and you get this movie has some profanity, and this one has a bit more, and like and then you just sort of get used to it, where it's like, well, like it's annoying. I wish they didn't have those, but that's just what movies have these days. You hear the
Right.
language, and hopefully the kids don't repeat what they hear. Like there is sort of a sense that we just sort of have become a bit numb, and like
Yeah.
to especially with like family films, which you would think would be clean, but even like faith-based films, because there's been. I mean, you don't necessarily, unless Mark Wahlberg is making it, like Father Stew, you don't necessarily get like a Wolf of Wall Street, like where it's just like F words and stuff. But like, it's been surprising how many of like the faith-based stuff I've done lately have started to have like mild profanities in them. Like, you know, maybe like a handful of them, and they're never like the F word, but um, and like you wouldn't expect that 10 years ago,
Yeah.
and now it's almost become standard. Like,
But Daniel, how else will we know that that character is a bad person if they don't use a curse word like in the beginning of the story?
yeah,
How are we as an audience to know?
I don't know how we can interpret if they're not an alcoholic and they swear at least once. That's usually sort of the shorthand. And I do think when it comes to like Christian, like faith-based stuff, that like that is the reason why. Like that
Yeah.
that is the justification of just, this is, we're trying to show the, the real rawness of the world. So like this character is going to say a mild profanity. I get,
Yeah.
it's trying to overcome the stigma that like faith-based stuff is this very, sanitized, squeaky clean. Like this is no real drama like
Yeah.
any other movie you would go to. And
These are real
um,
characters.
which I have problems with. Like because here's the thing, I'm not necessarily um, like when it comes to like content stuff, like sexual stuff for me is like at the top. Like that's the stuff you really need. Christians just shouldn't play around with. Profanity is like if you had to rank them on a hierarchy, for me comes near the bottom. Like I think,
Yeah.
do we need like should we fill our minds with that? Probably not. But I do think like even this like if you're trying to find like a scriptural basis, there really isn't a clear one as far as not watching movies with profanity. Like
Yeah.
I think as far as
In
like
fact,
a
it
proof
says very
text.
little about movies at all in
Yeah,
Scripture.
I know. I think
I was
anything's
shocked.
Jesus. That sermon got cut out, but there is because like there's like Ephesians 4:29 or 5:4, and like also Colossians 3:8. Like those are three verses that talk about like, as a Christian, like among other things, like don't let unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, or coarse joking, or rid yourself of malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Like there are verses that clearly say like your speech should be clean and like wholesome and like build up,
Yeah.
which isn't the same thing as like hearing it. Like it's not
Yeah.
not to like try and like dance around like how close to the line can we get, like, but there, like the idea that like hearing someone that's not a Christian swear, I don't think that's a sin. Like I think there's
Yeah.
a wisdom aspect to that of like Paul would say, whatever's good and pure, like focus on those things. Like I think but as far as just like it being morally wrong for you to like watch a movie that had some not made by Christians with swears, like I don't know if you can necessarily make um, like a strong case for that. That being said, like I think it is a wisdom thing, and like I don't think there's a strong justification for including that stuff, especially in a movie made by Christians.
Yeah.
Like
I think made by Christians. Again, there's other ways to um, indicate the depravity of man, perhaps, or show that some person is gritty or whatever. And I think also movies made for children, I think is the other one that it's wholly unnecessary to have like profanities in kids movies or like borderline kids movies like the Arthur the King, like based on the trailer that's kind of seems like a kids movie, or at least like what you would think of as like a family friendly movie. And so just seems out of character to have so much profanity in movies like that. I get it if you're like, Saving Private Ryan or like, you know, name your war flick. Like I can understand the reason to have a lot of language in those films, and it's like great. I'm not, taking my kids to that, and I think that's sort of the sort of agreement, cultural agreement that we have is like, yeah, there's going to be a lot of profanity in this war movie, but also you're not taking like kids to it.
yeah, it's sort of the
So
problem that like the places where we like I don't necessarily get mad if mainstream Hollywood films have profanity or something, but there was always like there's family films and there's sort of like the more faith-based stuff that like
yeah,
those were areas where you don't have to be exposed to that stuff, like you know and sort of like the problem now is that now some of that is filtering through, and I just find it disingenuous too. Like I think like because I've heard from people making these films about this issue, and it is like a you know to sort of push the envelope a bit and like be more authentic to like how people really talk, and which sounds good, but like we don't apply that to other stuff. Like
yeah,
like a faith-based film isn't going to have like a gratuitous nudity in a sexual scene because that's how, because people have sex and you need to show that, or like anything with violence. Like you're not going to see a bunch of like blood spurting out and stuff in some of these films, like, because that's how it would actually happen if someone got shot in this action movie. Like,
Yeah.
it's like we still can communicate and like, explore those things without having to like put sort of that more questionable content in it. And I feel like with profanity, it's sort of the same thing. Like, is that the only way, or is that kind of like a lazy way to just try and like showcase that we're not your grandfather's faith-based film, like we
Yeah.
swear, like, and I don't know, that just rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah, it is. I do think it is disingenuous because it's like, well, you're very clearly aiming this faith-based film at a particular audience, and that audience isn't going to want any of that stuff. But, rather than like focus on making excellent movies, you're just going to start, sprinkling in some edgy content to be like, see, we're not just for your Sunday school class. Like, well, so what are you trying to do here? And so if you are trying to like reach a broader audience, like surely that's not the way to
Well,
do
no
it.
one's convinced. Like
Right.
that's
That's
the like I
just
know like the Amazon movie On a Wing and a Prayer, which I think we both saw.
yeah.
They did that. They had a couple kind of mild profanities, but like the movie's squeaky clean faith-based film. Like it's
Yeah.
not a gritty. Like no one's watching that and being like, "Well, I thought it was just for those lame sheltered Christians," but this character swore, and I think maybe this is a gritty, gripping, authentic drama. Like it's not convincing anyone.
Right.
There's more to being honest about like what we're portraying than just throwing in a couple, sprinkling in a few swears and like
Yeah,
making it.
and I don't want this to like just be a whole like bashing of faith-based films. Um but yeah, I think that like I just think there's so many other ways um to communicate what they're trying to communicate without just kind of again taking a bit of the easy route and just sort of shoving in a word here or there. And it's just it does I don't think it services the film or the audience in the way that maybe they intended to or that they think
Yeah,
it's
and
gonna
especially
be.
just in a time when it does seem like we've all become desensitized to a lot of the profane speech. Like, I don't think we need to be contributing to that. But and this would be my soapbox too, just as a parent to like these kids' movies. Like, I
Yeah.
just don't want these cartoons cussing on screen. Like, I don't
Yeah,
think
there
I don't
really
think we
isn't.
need that. Like, there isn't a justification. Like, hey, give me a gritty adult, noir film, and the characters are swearing. Like, I don't want to just fill my mind with that stuff. But I can handle that without being overly offended. But like, I don't need like Puss in Boots swearing or something like
Yeah, there's
that
it.
kind of stuff. That I feel like that is a very valid thing for Christians and just families to like to be upset or at least push back on. But kind of the
Yeah.
next, speaking of movies, whether they contain profane words or they are not, sort of the next segment of our podcast we have out now and coming soon.
So Daniel, there's a lot of stuff coming up in the next few weeks here. We've got The First Omen, Monkey Man, Civil War, Abigail, The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, and Unsung Hero, just to name a few.
Yes, this is not a whole lot of heavy hitters this month. Like we're at the start of April, kind of going into a bit of a lull before like the summer
The summer
movies.
blockbusters.
So you're not getting a lot of big things. Not a whole lot this month that necessarily gets me amped up to go to the theater. Although there are a couple that I think are interesting. Like Civil War is a movie that it seems intentionally that it's going to push a lot of buttons, poke some people.
Yeah.
Um,
In an election year.
in an election year, and I don't know. Like as someone that reviews movies, the worst thing, like the worst kind of movies are the ones that are just boring. Like
Yeah.
if it's really bad, that's fun to review. If it's really good, that's fun to review. If it's like getting into some real thorny stuff, like even if I disagree with a lot of it, like that's
Yeah.
fun. It's the movies that are just like, hey, like, Ghostbusters. I guess it's a movie. Like, you can go see it. There's characters and there's some
There's
laughs
a
and
beginning, middle, and end.
like, and Civil War seems like the kind of movie, if it's done well, that like whether you have a bunch of issues with it or like you hate it or you think it's dangerous, like there's gonna be stuff to bitch
Yeah.
about.
Well, I think just based on the trailer for it, and if you're not familiar with it, it's I think the premise is essentially like America current day like devolves into a civil war, and what does that look like? And so I think that's the premise is a super interesting thought experiment. Like, so what would happen if we had another civil war? And like, no, nobody wants that, but it's kind of an interesting and intriguing premise.
Yeah, I guess playing around with some meaty stuff, and it's an A24 film, which tends to make pretty good like
Yeah, they've got a
dramas
pretty
and
solid track record.
a bit more deeper. So that one is intriguing to me. Unsung Hero is not necessarily intriguing to me personally, but hey, it's not always just about me. But this is sort of the faith-based film that we get this month, based on the kind of the creative for King and Country, which is not a regular staple in my playlists. But I know they're wildly popular kind of Christian duo, like songwriters, and this is sort of their creating. I don't know necessarily if it's like their story or they're just somehow it's infused with their with what they do in their music and all that. But hey, it does seem like we've been getting at least like one faith-based thing every month, which is
Yeah, the quantity has gone up, and we hope the quality will follow.
so that comes out at the end of the month. So again, most of those movies coming out that we talked about, I'll be doing like in-depth reviews, and as we kind of get to those, those weeks, we'll kind of debrief about what we thought of those movies going forward.
Yeah, so be on the lookout for those reviews.
But speaking of sharing good things with with the masses and digging deep into important cultural things, the last segment of this week's episode, we have things we like that you should like too. So Sam, I know you're amped up because this is my week.
I'm on the edge, practically off my seat.
And I did. I kind of changed course from what I was going to share. Last week you shared some classical music.
Yes.
I didn't necessarily
trying to bring some culture into this thing that we're doing here, Daniel.
Yeah, I didn't want our listeners and those watching the podcast to get a wrong sense of like our musical tastes, or to think lowly that we just listened to classical stuff from years ago. So I thought I would
that lowbrow stuff.
So I thought I would just elevate sort of our cultural discussion on music and share about one of my favorite German power metal bands. So the band,
Don't say.
Their name, which again this indicates that something is going to be good, is "Don't Drop the Sword."
And how do you say that in German?
I haven't quite figured that one out, but I'm sure.
I thought you were a fan.
But I'm sure it sounds epic. So "Don't Drop the Sword" is a kind of an indie underground power metal band with some thrash influences from Germany. And despite being relatively unknown even in the metal scene, they go out last year and drop an album called Age of Heroes, which turns out to arguably be the greatest metal album of the year.
Wow.
So I would describe them as sort of like, think of like a medieval bard, like from back in the day, like singing songs about things. And then like imagine if they had an electric guitar. All their songs are very bardic. Like they sing about like, Hercules and Robin Hood and stuff, but like, and they have a lot of like acoustical like interludes that sound like you're in like a medieval tavern, but then they have like shredding guitar solos and thrash. And so if you do want to cleanse your palate from what Sam was recommending and want something with a bit more
those dry, boring symphonies,
a bit more sophistication, check out "Don't Drop the Sword," their second album, Age of Heroes. Definitely worth checking out. Are you excited for this?
I'm very excited to promptly forget everything you just said. As soon as this podcast is over.
He says that now, but as soon as you hear the first some of those songs, you'll be a believer. Hey.
Although I do like medieval stuff. There's it reminded me of there's like a guy on YouTube I think who does like medieval renditions of like popular songs. Like I think there's one of like Eminem, but it's all like in like medieval instrumentation, and I think that's pretty awesome. So
yeah, hey, that sound.
Who doesn't love the medieval times?
Yeah, especially when it can be infused with some heavy metal. But in order to let you guys go off and go Google "Don't Drop the Sword," we can bring our podcast episode to a close. Fourth episode, another fun episode. Thanks, guys, for joining us every week as we just sort of dig into what's going on. I'm sure there'll be a lot next week, different stories and cultural stuff. So hope you will join us every Thursday. But thanks for joining us. See you then, and join us for some more conversations on faith and pop culture.